now classic text, Niebuhr laid out several different stances that individual communities and individuals and Christian communities might assume vis-a-vis the culture or the world in which they found themselves. The first of these he called Christ of culture. Here, Christian believers have a very optimistic view of the world and its values, such that there is an almost seamless back and forth between their Christian faith and the world in which they live. There is no contradiction or even little tension between being a Christian and being a lawyer or a merchant or an entertainer and so on. As I look around today, one possible example of such a stance might be Mitt Romney. Not necessarily his stance towards American culture as a whole, and I'm not thinking of his candidacy as a whole, but at least to business culture. And if, to quote Calvin Coolidge very much out of context, the chief business of the American people is business, then a presidential candidate's stance towards this culture is very important. For Romney, there appears to be a tremendous upside and almost no downside to corporate culture and to businesses, large or small. Corporate leaders, including very wealthy ones, are job creators, rarely if ever job killers in order to increase profit margins. Business leaders will almost always do the right thing if only government with its taxes and regulations would let them do it. A second, diametrically opposed stance, Niebuhr labeled Christ against culture. Here, Christians see the world as a dangerous, sinful place, better to steer clear of it, or radically try to change it. As for business culture, it's hardly the rosy picture some might paint, but rather the greedy world of Gordon Gekko, the 1980s Wall Street, or of Goldman Sachs, as depicted by Greg Smith in his March 13th New York Times op-ed piece, Why I Left Goldman Sachs. Not so much in terms of business culture, but in other ways I suppose Rick Santorum fills this profile, radically, aggressively trying to change a wayward America and reverse the sellout to American secular culture that Santorum finds, for instance, in John F. Kennedy's separation of church and state speech to Baptist ministers over 50 years ago. When it comes to aggressive Christ against business culture stances, I suppose you could also look to some of our colleges and universities, especially in the humanities and even in theology departments, to see if business is a dirty word. But another example of Christ against culture, a peaceful, non-aggressive example, might be found in a New York Times report a few weeks ago entitled Broken Trust in God's Country, which told of a Ponzi scheme in Mennonite and Amish country. On the one hand, this story about how a long-standing member of this tight-knit community, in league with disreputable investment experts, victimized fellow members, drew immediate comparisons with the Bernie Madoff case, where often the victims were Madoff's fellow Jews. But the story brought out radical differences too. For example, how the victims had compassion for their victimizer, and how the community leaders politely thanked the judge who refused their request to let them sort things out according to their own ways. As one can imagine, this case has been terribly upsetting to the Mennonite and Amish community. But it leads us, at least it leads me, to ask certain questions about Christian perspectives on doing business. For one thing, this case could simply confirm a Christ against culture stance. Wall Street, Greg Smith's Wall Street, is no place for Christians. And this possibility should, I think, give us pause. Now, one might say that the Amish are simply not living in the real world. But what real world would that be? The world of costly wars and oil spills, and global warming and fragmented families? Or the world of small carbon footprints, a world where people know their neighbors and work with their hands, a world that resists war for oil and other ends, a world where justice and judgment on the world is pretty much left up to God. I, for one, think we ought not dismiss the Christ against culture stance, especially the nonviolent, simple living, sectarian kind. And yet there is, according to Niebuhr, a third way, one that neither loses its Christian identity to the world nor stands against it as purely evil. but is rather in some sort of tensive relationship with it. For Niebuhr, this third option could be broken down into Christ and culture in some kind of dialectical or paradoxical relationship exemplified by someone like Martin Luther, law and gospel, Christ above culture, where grace builds on nature, as is the case with Thomas Aquinas, or Christ transforming culture, which was Niebuhr's own favorite model. Obviously, I can't discuss any of this in detail, but it was worth thinking about this third option because it is probably where many Christians find themselves. One example would probably be Catholicism, which honors sectarianism in a way, for example, with its monasteries, but as a whole is not sectarian, and which engages the world, but not without the sort of critique found in Catholic social teachings and movements. Recall the title of the document from Vatican II, The Church in the Modern World, not of the world, not against it, but in it. It is sometimes said that the most important word in Catholicism is "and." Faith and reason, scripture and tradition, church and world, Christ and culture, let's say faith and business too. Another example grounded especially in the theology of St. Augustine is what is sometimes called Christian realism. Neither the cynical realism of Machiavelli or perhaps Goldman Sachs at its worst, nor the seemingly otherworldly idealism of the Amish. The most famous proponent of this view was Reinhold Niebuhr, H. Richer's brother. One of his many books bore the title, The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness. In this book and elsewhere, Niebuhr warned about the danger for Christians of falling in with the children of darkness in the world, the cynics, the manipulators, the Wall Street climbers, the frauds. But he also warned against siding with the naive idealists who thought the world could be bent to their will as though there were no sin, no need for coercive power or law to check what Augustine called the libido dominandi, the lust to dominate. It's not that the idealists, and here Niebuhr included pacifists, are blind to what the world needs. On the contrary, it is the idealists, not the cynical realists, who see exactly what history needs. The problem is they fail to see what is possible in history, or we might say this evening, what is possible in business. We are left then with a matter of some complexity and with many challenges, but also, I think, opportunities. So 2 brief closing remarks. First, I have said little about interreligious dialogue. Certainly there is much to be said and to be done. The one point I would wish to make is that the very diversity within particular traditions, I've talked about Christianity, might draw traditions together. I assume, for instance, that Islam very likely experiences and must deal with the very kinds of diversity I've been discussing. And maybe we can together sort things out. Second, since our setting is a university, I want to stress the importance of knowing more, not less. Mark Twain once said, "There are lies, damn lies, and statistics." Now, I suppose one might agree with Twain and use the truth in this statement as an excuse to dismiss studying statistics. Some students might welcome that. My own view is just the opposite. The truth in his statement should urge us to study statistics more, not less, to learn its power as well as its abuse. So too, the truth in Bassanio's statement about crafty lawyers should drive us educationally to study law and then use it well. And the danger of the proof-texting theologian should drive us to spend more time with sacred texts, the Bible, the Quran, as we also seek wisdom in many other religiously inspired texts and figures and movements. Theologians like me might try better to understand not only his or her own tradition, not only other religious tradition, but also some economics. And business people would do well, I think, to ponder the Bible and the Quran, to study papal encyclicals, theologians, and the hadiths. This difficult but enriching endeavor is, I believe, in part the business of education and a university. And it may be our business tonight as we come together as friends.